Have you ever sat quietly after a moment of decision, or maybe in the middle of one, and asked yourself, almost in a whisper, was that God or was that just me? If you have, dear soul, you are not alone. And the fact that you are asking that question at all, the fact that you care enough about the difference to stop and wonder, says something beautiful about where your heart is. It says that somewhere inside you, you believe that God speaks, that He is near enough to be heard, that the distance between heaven and the interior of your soul is not as vast as it sometimes feels. You are right to believe this, and today we want to sit with you in that question. Not to give you a formula or a checklist or a system that turns the voice of God into something you can manage and categorize, but to speak honestly, warmly, from the deep well of wisdom that Augustine of Hippo left us, about what it actually means to hear from God and how to begin, slowly and imperfectly, and with great grace toward yourself, to tell the difference. Augustine spent the early part of his life searching for a voice he could trust. He was a brilliant man, surrounded by brilliant people, in a world full of ideas and philosophies and voices all claiming to offer truth. And yet for all his searching, for all his listening, he could not find the voice that satisfied the deep hunger inside him. Not until he stopped trying to hear God on his own terms and allowed himself to be still enough to hear God on his own terms, and allowed himself to be still enough to hear God on his own terms, and allowed himself to be still enough to hear God on his own terms, and allowed himself to be still enough to hear God on his own terms. What Augustine discovered in that stillness, what he would want to speak to you today, is this: the problem is not that God is not speaking. The problem is that we have been living in so much noise, internal and external, that we have forgotten what it feels like to be truly quiet. And in the noise, every voice sounds the same. The voice of the flesh, the voice of fear, the voice of the enemy, the voice of our own wounds and desires and ambitions. All of it blends together into something we call our inner life, and we can no longer tell which thread is which. But they are not the same voice, beloved, and they can be distinguished, not easily and not all at once, and not without the patient and ongoing practice of a life oriented toward God. But truly, they can be distinguished. Let us begin with the voice you know best, because it is the one you have been listening to the longest. The voice of your own flesh. This voice is not evil in itself. It is simply the voice of the part of you that wants what is easy, what is comfortable, what feels good right now without too much consideration of what it costs later. It is the voice that says, you deserve this. It is the voice that says, just this once, it will not matter. It is the voice that says, God understands. He made you this way. He knows how hard you have been trying. It speaks in the first person. It uses your language. It knows exactly which arguments will be most persuasive to you specifically, because it is you. This is what makes it so difficult to distinguish from the genuine promptings of the Spirit. It is intimate. It knows your weaknesses and your longings. It speaks in a voice that sounds remarkably like your own deepest desires, because it is made of them. Augustine wrote of this voice with painful honesty in his Confessions. He described the years he spent listening to it, following it, rationalizing it, and the emptiness it always left in its wake. He wrote of praying, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. The flesh's voice was so fluent, so persuasive, so deeply woven into the fabric of who he had allowed himself to become, that even his prayers were infected with it. Even his turning toward God was mixed with the flesh's reluctance to fully arrive. Does this sound familiar, dear friend? Have you ever prayed a prayer with one part of you while another part of you was quietly negotiating terms? The voice of the flesh is not patient. This is one of its clearest signatures. It pushes. It wants now. It is uncomfortable with waiting, with silence, with the kind of slow and unspectacular obedience that does not immediately produce the results it was hoping for. Jesus said it plainly in Matthew 26:41. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The flesh avoids what the spirit is drawn to. It prefers distraction over prayer, preference over purpose, the comfort of the moment over the calling of the long road. If the voice inside you is urgent in a way that makes waiting feel impossible, if it is pushing you towards something with an impatience that does not allow for stillness or discernment, it is worth asking, is this God, or is this simply the flesh, dressed in the language of desire? Quote, was it simply the flesh, dressed in the language of desire? Now let me speak to you of a voice that is more difficult to name, because it does not announce itself, the voice of the enemy. This voice does not come with horns and fire. It does not present itself as opposition. It is, by its very nature, deceptive, and the deception is most effective when it is most subtle, when it sounds the most like a reasonable thought, when it sounds the most like you. Augustine was deeply aware of this voice. He wrote of the enemy's strategy as ancient and consistent, the same strategy used in the garden from the very beginning. Not a frontal assault, a whisper, a question, a small, precise doubt planted in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. Did God really say, "Are you sure? Is this really who you are? After everything you have done, do you really think God is still speaking to you?" The voice of the enemy is a voice of accusation and diminishment. It tells you that you have failed too many times to be trusted with hearing from God. It tells you that what you thought you heard was wishful thinking. It tells you that you are not the kind of person God speaks to clearly, that clarity is reserved for the especially holy, the especially faithful, the people whose lives do not look like yours. It tells you to be quiet and to settle and to stop expecting so much. If you have ever heard a voice that pushed you toward hopelessness, not holy conviction which leads you toward God and toward change, but the kind of hopelessness that makes you want to give up and withdraw, that voice was not from God. God does not speak to His children in the language of hopelessness. He does not use shame as a tool. He does not tell you that your past has disqualified your future. He does not isolate you from community, from prayer, from His own presence. Any voice that tells you there is no point in praying, no point in trying, no point in seeking, any voice that leads you away from God rather than toward Him is a voice that does not come from God. Augustine would say to you, learn to know the enemy not because you need to be afraid of him, but because you need to be able to see through him. A lie recognized is a lie that loses its power. The moment you say, out loud or in your heart, that is not true, and here is what is true, the voice of accusation loses its grip. And now, dear heart, let us speak of the voice you were made to hear, the voice of God. Augustine described this voice in his most honest and most beautiful writing as the voice that met him at the end of himself, not in the loudness, not in the impressive or the dramatic, but in the deep quiet after everything else had finally worn itself out. The voice that spoke not to his intelligence or his ambition, but to the place inside him that had been searching for so long that it had almost forgotten what it was searching for. God's voice does not compete with the noise of your life. It does not shout to be heard over the clutter of everything else you are carrying. It speaks from underneath, from deeper than the surface thoughts, from a place that is quieter and more certain than anything the flesh or the enemy can produce. And one of its most recognizable qualities is this: it brings peace, not the peace that means everything is comfortable and resolved and easy, but the peace that Paul described in Philippians 4-7, the peace that surpasses all understanding, the peace that has no logical explanation given the circumstances, the peace that settles on you in the middle of a difficult situation and tells you, without words, I am here, I see this, I have not left. This peace is a signature. When a thought or a sense or an impression brings with it that inexplicable, groundless, utterly real sense of peace, pay attention. God's voice also aligns with what He has already said. This is a filter that Augustine trusted deeply. God does not contradict Himself. He does not speak in the private moments of your interior life in ways that contradict the clear witness of Scripture. The Bible is not simply a rule book. It is a portrait of the character of God. And a voice that asks you to do something inconsistent with that character, however spiritual it may feel, is not his voice. Augustine would say, if the voice is leading you towards something that requires you to abandon love, abandon truth, abandon the clear testimony of what God has already revealed, stop. That is not God. God speaks in harmony with everything He has already spoken. His voice does not create confusion. It creates clarity, even when the clarity is uncomfortable, even when it requires something difficult from you. It is still clarity. You know where you stand, and God's voice draws you toward Him. This is perhaps the simplest and most reliable test of all. Every genuine prompting from God leads you in one direction, deeper into relationship with Him. It may come as a correction, as a challenge, as an invitation to something you are not sure you are ready for, but it always leads toward Him, not away. Toward prayer, toward community, toward the life of a person who is growing in dependence on God, rather than growing in isolation from Him. If a voice is pulling you away from God, even if it uses spiritual language, even if it sounds reasonable, follow the direction it is leading and ask, am I moving toward God or away from Him? The answer will tell you much about the source. Now let me speak to you about the seasons when God seems to be silent, because these seasons are real, and they are often the most disorienting of all. You have prayed, you have listened, you have been genuinely still, and nothing has come. No peace, no clarity, no sense of direction, only silence. Augustine knew this silence. He wrote of it not as the absence of God, but as one of God's most demanding invitations. An invitation to trust not the latest word, but the whole testimony of a life. To trust not the feeling of God's presence, but the fact of it. To stand in the silence not as someone who has been abandoned, but as someone who is being trusted to walk in what has already been given. Jesus Himself, in the wilderness, did not receive new instructions for every new temptation He faced. He reached back into what He had already received, the Word, the truth, the long relationship with the Father, and stood on it. When the silence comes, this is what God is asking of you. Not that you generate a new sense of His presence through sufficient effort or sufficient spirituality, but that you trust what you already know of Him, that you take the next step on the basis of what you have already been given. God's silence is not His absence. It is sometimes His deepest form of trust in you. And here is something Augustine would want us to say plainly, because it matters enormously. You cannot recognize a voice you have never spent time with. The ability to distinguish God's voice from all the other voices is not a gift that arrives fully formed. It is a capacity that is developed through relationship, through time in prayer, through time in the scriptures, through the slow, patient, often unspectacular practice of orienting your life toward God, not only in the dramatic moments, but in the ordinary ones. The more you know someone, truly know them, not just know about them, the more you recognize their voice. You recognize it in a crowded room. You recognize it in a text message without seeing the name. You recognize it because you have spent enough time with this person, that their particular way of speaking has become familiar to you in your bones. It is the same with God. The question, if you are still struggling to tell His voice from your own thoughts, may not be, why is He not speaking clearly? The question may be, how much time have I actually spent listening, not performing, not presenting, but simply being with Him, in the quiet, with nothing to offer except your presence and your willingness to hear. This is the invitation, dear soul. Not to a method, but to a relationship. Not to a formula for discerning God's voice, but to the daily, imperfect, beautiful practice of actually spending time with the one whose voice you want to recognize. Augustine spent years at a distance from God, and then years learning to close that distance. And what he found, as the distance closed, was not that God had suddenly started speaking more clearly. It was that Augustine had finally become quiet enough and close enough to hear what God had been saying all along. God has been speaking to you all along, dear heart, through the scriptures, through the quiet, through the peace that has settled on you in unexpected moments, through the gentle conviction that has led you back when you drifted away. He has been speaking. The invitation today is simply to draw closer, to spend more time, to become so familiar with His voice that when He speaks, in whatever form it comes, however quietly, you will know. Before we close, we want to ask you something, and we genuinely want to hear your answer in the comments. When was the last time you felt certain that you heard from God? What did that experience feel like? How did you know? Your answer may be exactly what someone else needs to read today, because there are people who come here who have never had that experience, who are not sure it is possible for them, who need to hear from someone real that God speaks, that He spoke to you specifically in your life. Share it. Let your story be a testimony to someone who is still learning to listen. And if today's message has stirred something in you, if you felt, as you listened, that something was speaking directly into a question you have been carrying, then stay with us. Subscribe so that next week's reflection finds you. And write in the comments today, God, teach me to recognize your voice. Let that simple prayer be the beginning of something. Because the voice you learn to recognize today will guide the decisions that shape your tomorrow. And a single word from God, one genuine, clear, peace-carrying word from the one who made you and knows you and loves you, can change the direction of everything. Go in peace, dear soul, and keep listening. There is something else we want to sit with you on, dear heart. Something that does not always get said in these conversations about hearing God's voice, but which Augustine would consider essential, and that is the role of community in discernment. We live in a time that prizes the personal and the private above almost everything else. The relationship with God is often presented as something entirely interior, you and God alone in the quiet of your own heart. And while the interior life is irreplaceable, while there is a depth of communion with God that happens only in solitude, we were never designed to do the work of discernment entirely alone. Augustine understood this deeply. He was shaped, guided, and corrected by community, by his mother Monica, whose faithful prayers anchored him through his years of wandering, by Ambrose, whose preaching opened the door in him that he had long believed was sealed, by the community of friends with whom he lived and prayed and wrestled with the great questions of faith. He would be the first to say that the voice of God came to him not only in the private moments of his interior life, but through the voices of the people God placed around him. The body of Christ is one of the ways God speaks, not as a replacement for personal discernment, but as a confirmation of it. When what you are sensing in your interior life is confirmed by the wisdom of people who know you, love you, and are themselves genuinely oriented toward God, that confirmation carries real weight. And when what you are sensing is consistently questioned or contradicted by people of genuine spiritual wisdom in your life, that too deserves serious attention. Pride whispers that the private word is always the truest word, that what God says to me alone must be trusted above what others might say. But Augustine would challenge this. He would say, the genuinely humble soul is the one who holds even its most personal convictions loosely enough to submit them to the community of faith. Not because the community is always right, but because the self is not always right either, and because God, in His wisdom, often uses the perspective of others to balance and correct and complete what He is saying to us personally. If you are carrying a sense of direction from God, dear soul, especially if that direction is significant, life-altering, difficult to explain, we encourage you to bring it into community, to find people whose faith you respect, whose lives reflect genuine relationship with God, whose love for you is real enough to tell you hard truths, and to lay before them what you are sensing, not to hand them the authority to decide for you, but to welcome the gift of their perspective. And if no one in your life currently occupies that role, if you are in a season where that kind of trusted community is not available to you, then this itself is worth bringing before God. Lord, give me the people I need to help me hear you more clearly. This is a prayer He loves to answer. Now let us speak about something that runs even deeper than discernment, something that Augustine considered the foundation beneath the whole question of hearing God's voice, and that is the question of desire. Augustine believed that the desires of the heart were not simply obstacles to hearing God. They were part of how God speaks. He wrote in one of his most often quoted reflections, "Love God and do what you will." On the surface, this sounds like permission for anything, but Augustine meant something much more specific. He meant that the soul that has genuinely and deeply given itself to loving God will find over time that its desires begin to change, that the things it reaches for become aligned with what God reaches for, that the will is not simply suppressed or overridden, but transformed. This matters enormously for the question of discernment, because if the deep desire of your heart, not the surface want, not the immediate impulse, but the deep desire, the one that remains when you pray honestly for a long time, is pointing you towards something, that desire deserves to be taken seriously as part of God's communication with you. The flesh wants what is easy and immediate. The enemy pushes you toward what is dark and isolating and distant from God. But the deep, sustained, purified desire of a heart that is genuinely oriented toward God, this desire can be one of the ways He speaks. Augustine trusted this. He would tell you, do not dismiss your deepest desires as simply your own. Some of them were placed there. Some of them are God's voice, speaking through the very shape of who He made you to be. The question worth asking is, has this desire been brought before God? Has it been prayed over, examined, submitted? Has it grown more specific and more settled over time, rather than more frantic and more urgent? Does it remain present in your quiet moments, not only in your excited ones? A desire that holds its shape through seasons of prayer and waiting, that does not evaporate when the emotion fades, is a desire worth paying close attention to. We also want to speak, dear heart, about the relationship between obedience and hearing, because Augustine observed something in his own life that many people discover as they grow in their walk with God. The more you obey the last clear word God gave you, the more clearly the next word comes. This is not a transaction. God does not reward obedience with new instructions, the way an employer rewards performance with a raise. It is more organic than that. It is the nature of relationship. When you act on what you have been given, when you take the step that was asked of you, even when it was uncomfortable, even when you were not entirely sure, you build a kind of trust in yourself that opens something. You discover in the doing that God was faithful to the word He gave, that the step He asked for did not lead you off a cliff, that He was there in the action, as He promised. And this experience of His faithfulness in the last step makes it easier to trust the next word and the next. Many people are waiting to hear a clearer word from God, while not yet acting on the last clear word they received. Augustine would gently but honestly say, move on the light you have. Act on what you know. Take the step that has already been made clear to you, and watch how the next step becomes clearer in the moving. God rarely gives the whole map at once. He gives enough light for the next step. And the next step, when taken, reveals the light for the step after that. This is how He leads. Not in grand, complete, fully detailed revelations that require no faith, but in the daily, step-by-step, relationship-deepening walk of someone who is learning to trust a voice they are coming to know more and more. So, dear soul, if you have been waiting for clarity before you move, consider this. Perhaps the clarity comes in the moving. Perhaps God is waiting for you to trust Him with the partial knowledge you already have before He gives you more. What is the step that has already been made clear to you? What is the thing you know you are supposed to do that you have been delaying because you are waiting to feel more certain? We would love for you to share in the comments, not what you are waiting to hear from God, but what you have already heard and not yet acted on. Sometimes naming it out loud is the first act of obedience, and we want to close with this, beloved, with the thing that Augustine would most want you to carry away from everything we have shared today. You were made for this, for the sound of His voice, for the intimacy of a relationship with the God who made you, who knows you by name, who has been speaking to you quietly, persistently, lovingly, since the very beginning of your life. Before you knew how to listen, before you knew there was a voice to listen for, He was already speaking. The distance you may feel between yourself and the clear voice of God is not permanent. It is not fixed. It is not evidence that you are not the kind of person He speaks to. It is simply the distance of a relationship that has not yet been fully cultivated. And like every relationship, it closes with time, with attention, with the patient, daily, sometimes unglamorous practice of showing up, of being present, of choosing again and again to prioritize the quiet of God's presence over the noise of everything else competing for your attention. Augustine wrote, "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." The restlessness you feel, the longing for clarity, for direction, for the settled knowledge of what God is saying, is not a problem. It is the right instinct. It is your soul telling you the truth. This is not where I am meant to rest. The rest is in Him. And the way to rest is the way of nearness, of drawing close, of learning His voice, the way you learn any beloved voice, by spending time with it, by listening, by paying attention, by returning again and again until the familiar becomes unmistakable. Draw near, dear heart. He is nearer than you know, and He is speaking. Write in the comments today what is one thing you believe God has been trying to say to you that you have perhaps been afraid to fully hear. You do not have to have it perfectly understood. Just begin. Share what you have. Let this community be a place where the voice of God is honored and listened to together. And if you have not yet subscribed, do it now so that next week's message finds you. Because this conversation is just beginning. Go in peace, dear soul. Keep listening. He is speaking. Before we truly close, dear soul, there is one more thing Augustine would insist we say, and it is perhaps the most personal thing of all. Many people who struggle to hear God's voice carry beneath the practical question of discernment a deeper and more painful question. And it is this: does God actually want to speak to me? Not in general, not to people in general, but to me specifically, with my particular history, my particular failures, my particular distance from where I know I should be. This is the question that lives beneath the question. And if we do not address it, everything else we have said will sit on top of it, without reaching it. So let us say it plainly. Yes, He wants to speak to you, not despite who you are, to you as you are, with full knowledge of everything you have done and everything you have not done, everything you have been and everything you have failed to be. He wants to be heard by you, and He wants to hear you, and the desire for that closeness is not something you have to earn your way back to. Augustine is perhaps the most powerful testimony to this truth in all of Christian history. Here was a man who spent years in deliberate distance from God, who knew better and chose otherwise, who was, by any reasonable spiritual accounting, a man who had put significant distance between himself and the one who made him. And yet, the voice did not stop. The drawing did not cease, the love did not cool. Augustine wrote of God's relentless pursuit of him through all those years of wandering, not as an angry pursuit, not as a pursuit driven by demand or by judgment, but as the pursuit of love, a love that would not stop reaching, a love that found him in philosophy and found him insufficient there, found him in ambition and found him restless there, found him in pleasure and found him empty there, until finally, after everything else had failed, he was still enough to hear the voice that had been speaking all along. And what that voice said to him was not, "Where have you been? What took you so long? Look at the years you wasted." What the voice said, what Augustine heard in that garden, in that moment when everything finally broke open, was simply, "Come, I am here. You are home." This is the voice that is speaking to you, dear heart. Whatever your history, however long you have been away, however many times you have half listened and then turned back toward the noise, the invitation is the same. Come, I am here. You are home. And hearing this voice, really hearing it in the place where it is actually speaking, begins not with method, but with this, with believing that He wants to be heard by you, that the silence between you is not His preference, that He has been reaching toward you through every circumstance, every moment of beauty, every pang of conviction, every inexplicable peace, and every restless ache, all of it a form of speaking, all of it a form of drawing near. He is speaking, dear soul. He has always been speaking. The only question is whether you will be still enough today to hear. Go in peace and keep listening. We want to speak to you one final time about something practical, something you can carry into the very next hour of your life after you finish listening to this. The practice of discernment, Augustine taught, is not something that happens only in the extraordinary moments, not only when you are facing a major decision, not only when the stakes are high and the need for clarity is urgent. It happens in the ordinary moments, the small, unremarkable, daily moments that make up the actual texture of a life. Every morning before the noise of the day begins, even if it is only for a few minutes, even if your schedule is full and your mind is already moving toward everything waiting for you, there is a practice available to you. The practice of simply being present before God, not filling the silence with words, not presenting your requests, not working through your prayer list, simply being present, saying, in whatever words come naturally, I am here, I am listening, of choosing, in that moment, the company of God over the comfort of the noise. And over time, this practice builds something. It builds the quality of attention that makes hearing possible. It trains the interior ear to listen. It creates, in the daily texture of your life, a space where God's voice can land. Augustine would say, do not wait for a special moment to seek God's voice. Seek it in the ordinary moment, in the moment of the commute, the meal, the walk, the quiet before sleep. Bring your interior life before Him in the small moments, and you will find that the small moments are where He most often speaks. And when something comes, a thought that seems to arrive from outside your own generating, a sense of peace that has no logical basis, a clarity about something that was previously confused, a conviction about the direction you had not considered, write it down. Not to analyze it immediately, but to honor it. To say, something came, I noticed it, I am holding it, and then bring it back to God in prayer. Does this align with what you have already said? Does this lead me towards you or away from you? Does this produce peace when I sit with it, or anxiety? Let the questions do their work over time. Discernment is not usually an event. It is a process. A slow, patient trust-building process between a soul and the God who made it. And every person who has ever described a life of genuine intimacy with God, Augustine, among the most eloquent of them, has described it as the fruit of exactly this, the long, faithful, daily practice of showing up and listening. So today, before you leave us, we want to give you one simple thing to take with you. One practice, one next step. Tonight, before you sleep, or this morning, if now is your morning, take 5 minutes, just 5. Find a quiet place if you can, and say these words, or something like them. God, I want to know your voice. I want to learn to hear you. I am here. I am listening. Speak to me, however you choose, and then wait. Not for fireworks, not for an audible voice or a dramatic experience. Simply wait and notice what comes. It may be nothing obvious the first time or the second, but keep returning. Keep showing up, because the God who made you has been waiting for exactly this, for you to turn toward Him and say, I want to hear you, and He will answer. He always answers. Go in peace, dear soul, and keep your heart turned toward the voice that has been calling you home since before you knew there was a home to return to. We will see you again, and until then, listen.